So welcome to lecture number 134 of the Mora Nevuchim of the Guide for the Perplexed. Um, we are about to begin chapter 50, that's 50 in part 3 of the Mora Nevuchim. And when I say page numbers, I'm referring to the Shlomo Pinas edition. We are on page number 613 of book 2, and we're about to start chapter 50, 50. Rambam just completed his monumental section on the reasons for the mitzvot, on the explanations and the rational reasons for the commandments. The logical next chapter then would be to refer to, so in other words, he was trying to explain to us that even though many of the laws that the Torah gives us to follow don't necessarily seem rational on the surface, but we need to know and understand that there are rational reasons for it. Often we can figure out what those reasons are. Sometimes we would know the reasons if we understood the historical context, the context within which it was given, etc. And he gave us some clues and approaches to how to understand them. Now in chapter 50, he is going to deal with a very similar problem, and that is, what about the stories and the things that the Torah seems to teach us and tell us that don't seem to have any logical reason for being there, right? You know, some of the stories, it's obvious they teach us specific lessons and ideas, you know, things that are important for us to know. But sometimes the Torah tells us things that it's very puzzling as to why in the world are they here. So the Rambam, just like he had to deal with mitzvot, with commandments that didn't seem to have a reason, but Rambam insists that there is a logical and discernible reason, if only we knew the history, the story, etc. The same thing Rambam is going to deal with a similar problem with mitzvot, with ideas, with verses in the Torah that seem to have no obvious purpose. So there are also things that belong to the mysteries of the Torah. I'm starting to read at chapter 50 in the beginning, which have caused many people to stumble. Now, the Goodman-Lieberman translation didn't translate it mysteries. They had a little better word. Mysteries gives us this mysterious kind of sound, but it's not really. I'm going to go back to their translation. Sorry. Stories that may seem odious, Torah mysteries. He does use the word mysteries, I'm sorry. Anyway, accordingly, they ought to be explained. So we need to understand why the Torah says these things. These are the stories recounted in the Torah, the telling of which is thought to be useless. It seems to have no purpose. As for instance, the account of the branching out of tribes from Noah, right, and of their names and dwelling places. Like the lineage is listed, this family, that family, the other family, and where they lived. Likewise, the sons of Seir, the Horite, the account of the kings that reigned in the land of Edom and the like. You know the saying of the sages that the impious Manasseh, right? Manasseh, it's not referring to Manasseh, the son of Jacob, the forefather of the tribe of Manasseh. He's referring to Manasseh, the king Manasseh, who is in one of the most evil kings in the history of the kings of Judah. The Chachamim said, the sages in the Gemara report that Manasseh occupied his vile counsel with nothing but criticism of such passages. They say he used to sit there and interpret scripture by means of blasphemous Haggadot. Thus he said, Moshe did not have to write, and the sister of Lotan was Timnah, and so on. So in other words, why did he have to write these verses in the Torah that seem to have no meaning, right? So just like we said before, the mitzvot, some of them seem to evade a logical explanation, and the Rambam attempted to explain to us what the logical reasons were. The same thing, these verses, they seem to have no logical reason for being there. Who cares that Lotan's sister was Timnah? We don't really know who Lotan was. We don't know who Timnah was. What does it mean? What's the purpose of it? As for me, I shall inform you of a general principle, and then I shall come back to the details as I did with regard to the reasons for the commandments. I'm going to give you a general approach to these verses, and then you can take that approach and and I'll give you some examples of specifics and how to use my general approach to analyze specifics. And of course, like similar to the mitzvot, the Rambam will leave many of these types of verses to us to figure out on our own, but he's going to give us some guidance on how to do that. Remember, he's finishing up the book called The Guide for the Perplexed. So this is just, he's trying to wrap up things that perplex people about the Torah, and this is, of course, one of them. What's the purpose and point of verses like this? So before I even continue the next paragraph, which starts with the word "know that all the stories" in the second to the bottom on page 613, I just want to remind everyone that in the Rambam, and in the Rambam's time, right, they had no understanding of history the way we do, right? When we look back at history, we have tons and tons of research into anthropology and archaeology, going back, the development of history. The Greeks in the time of the Rambam, and the Greeks in the time not the Greeks at the time of the Rambam, the Greeks writings that the Rambam was very familiar with, from Aristotle and then those that succeeded him. Remember, Aristotle thought that the world was the way it was because it always was that way. So if you would have asked Aristotle, what would the world have looked like had you come here 20,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, Aristotle would have basically told you that the world is basically the same. He would have assumed that people live in the same kinds of places and cities and done the same kinds of things and farmed the same kinds of foods and domesticated the same kinds of animals. They didn't really have an understanding that, like we have, of the progression of history from way back when people lived a certain way all the way to the way people live now. So the Rambam also therefore remember, the Rambam argued on Aristotle and said that there was a time of creation, as opposed to Aristotle that thought that everything had. So according to Rambam, the main difference between his understanding of history and Aristotle's understanding of history was that that there was a time when it all started, right? As opposed to Aristotle, who felt that it was always around this way. So, and understanding this as we read the rest of the chapter will help us guide through this. And remember, the Rambam also had no reason in his time not to take the Torah at its word for the time factor. In other words, the how old the world was, right? The age of the universe, so to speak, right? The Rambam had no reason to assume, if there was a moment of creation, that it wasn't, whatever, in his day 5,000 years ago, or or so on. So so the Rambam looks at these events, as historical, even though other parts of the Torah, such as the three angels visiting Abraham, he looked at as an allegory, as a mashal, right, as a dream sometimes, right? The things that he felt were not the things that conflicted with the science that he knew, he said they were just a dream or something like that. However, here he had no reason to assume that there was anything not literal about the timeline of the Torah. Just another note about Aristotle, and that is that and I don't know this from being an expert in Aristotle myself. I know this from reading all the various commentaries on the guide that tell me about Aristotle. So I'm secondhand knowledge here, but I'll do this the best. Aristotle was only interested in history in the sense that maybe there was a guy, a leader, whatever, that lived 500 years before, that did something great that teaches us a lesson, right? That was the only history that they knew and understood in those days. So they learned history in order to learn, oh yes, the king so and so, he was great because he did such and such. So that was important to learn, important to remember. But the idea that of the progression of history was something that was completely foreign to them and foreign to the Rambam. He would not have known that. So bear that in mind as we learn this. Know that all the stories that you will find mentioned in the Torah occur there for a necessary utility for the Torah. Either they give a correct notion of an opinion that is a pillar of the Torah, or they rectify some action, so that mutual wrongdoing and aggression should not occur between men. I shall set this forth to you in orderly fashion. So even though, right, those stories don't seem to have a purpose on the surface, they do have a purpose, and that purpose is to teach us something, to teach us something that the Torah is trying to, that's important, an idea that it's important for the Torah to try to teach us, okay? So as it is a pillar of the Torah that the world was produced in time, you know, the Rambam emphasized this over and over again throughout the Sefer, that he disagrees with Aristotle, that this is his one fundamental disagreement is that the world was created. There was a time when the world started, as opposed to Aristotle, who believed in the eternity of the universe. So because that is the pillar, really the pillar upon which the entire Torah rests, that at first, so then, and then at first, a single individual of the human species, namely Adam, was created. You know, at the time of creation, during that first week of creation, a person was created, right? And that approximately 2,500 years elapsed between Adam and Moses, right? Men, if they were given this information only, if they only knew that, right? That is the pillar of the Torah. You and I know that and understand that, and that makes sense, right? But if that was all the Torah said, without giving those lineages, it would rapidly have begun to, people would rapidly have begun to have doubts in those times. For people were to be found scattered up to the ends of the whole earth, there are people all over the planet, you know, and in the known earth in his time was pretty large. Had they known then how big the world really was, they would have even been more flabbergasted. How did people get around the whole planet? There were different tribes and different and very dissimilar languages. These doubts were put to an end through an exposition of the genealogy of all of them, right? So therefore the Torah went and described all of them and their branching. I just turned to page 614 by mentioning the names of the famous men among them, such and such, the son of such and such, and their ages, and by giving the facts regarding their habitats and the reason that necessitated their being scattered to the ends of the earth and the languages being different in spite of their having at first dwelt in one place. It had to tell the stories to show how different languages came about. People lived in different places, so they started developing different cultures. And having had all of them one language, originally, a fact that was a necessary consequence of their being the children of a single individual, since they all started with one language, but over time other languages developed, etc. So that's why the Torah gives us this history, right? It may not be complete, but it's enough to show us that it's possible that all the people from all around the world, and all the different languages and cultures and etc., 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 all came from one family, from one person, one initial couple, right? In the same way, the story of the flood and the story of Sodom and and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah, were recounted in order to bring proof for the following correct opinion. That story was brought for a reason, to teach us a lesson. That verily there is a reward for the righteous, verily there is a God that judges on earth, right? That a corrupt society that's evil will meet its evil end, right? And there is a judge, there is justice, right? In the same way, the relation of that war of the 9 kings is made with the view to making known to us the miracle consisting in the victory of Abraham, accompanied by a small number of men having no king with them over 4 great kings. So that the story of the 5 kings versus the 4 kings and Abraham's victory. It also gives us knowledge of his defense of his relative. We learn something from that he stood up to defend his family, right? Because of the latter's sharing his belief, because Lot was also a believer in God. So Abraham stood by his side and helped him, and of his exposing himself to the dangers of war until he saved him. And that when you stand up for your family, sometimes that means you're putting your life at risk, and Abraham was willing to do that. It also gives us knowledge of how moderate and easily satisfied he was, right? Because at the end of the story, when the king of Sodom offered him all these riches, and Abraham wasn't interested. So it shows how, I'm not doing this for all the glory and the booty and the winnings and the whatever. That's not, I did this because it was the right thing to do, and I'm going to move on. It also gives us of his contempt for acquisition. He didn't want to get wealthy, and of his striving for moral nobility. This is expressed by saying, from even a thread to a shoe latchet, right? Is the pasuk, right? I'm not interested in any of that. I'm gaining wet, even a shoelace, right, from you. So all these stories have a reason and have a purpose. So they may not seem that way on the surface, but if you think about it, you'll find one. The enumeration of the tribes of the children of Seir and their individual genealogy is made with the view to one single commandment, right? The reason why he tells the genealogy of Seir, which is the genealogy of the descendants of Esau, right, which eventually ended up one of the descendants of Esau was Amalek, and Amalek is the progenitor of the nation of Amalek, who were commanded to wipe out. And Rambam already went through the explanation of that command, because that their entire culture was so corrupt and evil, and God wanted to teach that when an entire culture is corrupt and evil, it deserves to be wiped out. Rambam said that back in I forget. I think if I remember correctly, it was chapter 34 of part 3. If I'm wrong, forgive me. But so maybe it's all commanding the extermination only of the seed of Amalek. It's going to be interesting, because since the command is only to kill Amalek, right, and his family, his descendants, so he did not command killing the other children of Esau. But Esau was connected by marriage with the children of Seir, right? So as it is set forth in the text. So he had issue from them and reigned over them, and his descendants mingled with theirs. So consequently, the whole land of Seir and those tribes were called after the predominant tribe. Namely, they were all called the children of Esau. And particularly descendants of Amalek, for they were the bravest among them. They were the most prominent fighters, right? So accordingly, if there had been no explanation concerning these genealogies and their particulars, all of them would have been killed through neglectfulness. People would have thought that we're supposed to wipe them all out. So the Torah tells us, no, they're all mixed in, right? So don't wipe them all out, right? They all deserve to live. So consequently, Scripture explained their tribes and said that those whom you seem to say in Seir in the kingdom of Amalek, even if you go to the place called Amalek land, wherever that was, right, are not all of them children of Amalek, but some are descendants of this or that individual, and they're only called Amalek because the latter's mother belonged to them. All this was an act of justice on the part of God, lest the tribe be killed indiscriminately in the course of extermination of another tribe. Because God didn't want them all killed. So by showing you that they're all mixed together, you won't go and think, oh, I'm going to kill them all, and then you kill people that don't deserve to be killed. But the decree was only directed against the descendants of Amalek, and we have already explained in what way that wisdom is manifest therein. Sorry, it was chapter 41, my mistake. He says it on the bottom. Why killing Amalek? We talked about it a little bit in more detail when we did 41, but I said devoting time to discussing the issue of the moral questions that command raises is a very important subject, but not the topic of our group right now. So anyway, bottom line is that's how Rambam understands the reason for all of that genealogy. I'm on page 615 at the top now. The reason for the Torah's, the scripture's enumeration of the kings that reigned in the land of Edom is the fact that according to one of the commandments, thou mayest not set a foreigner over thee who is not thy brother. That when you establish a king, the king has to be a native-born Israelite. He can't be someone that came from another nation. Now that not one of the kings that are enumerated is from Edom. Do you not see that it sets forth their genealogy and their country? This one was from this place and that one was from that place. In my opinion, so in our country, we always appoint one of our own. In their country, they're constantly bringing in kings from here, king from there, king from the other place. It is probable, in my opinion, Rambam says, that their conduct and their histories were generally known. I mean, the conduct of those kings of Edom. Probably everyone in the time knew, right? And knew the history. They knew who these kings were, and they knew where they came from, and they knew that they tyrannized over the children of Esau and humiliated them. Accordingly, in mentioning them, it says, as it were, consider your brethren, the children of Esau. Think about them, whose kings were this one and that one, whose actions were generally known. For no individual has ever been the king of a religious community to whose race he did not belong, without doing it great or small injury. When you bring in someone from outside, when he's not one of their own, he usually treats them with contempt and oppression. So basically, so the Rambam is making a historical assumption, which may or may not be true. He admits that. He's just assuming that probably, right, what happened was other kings would come and then they would tyrannize the people. So therefore, the Torah is telling you that I'm commanding you to make sure to appoint one of your brethren, so he'll be more likely to rule over you with compassion. So you learn from the genealogy, and the important aspect of the story is that if by knowing the history of the people of the kings of Edom and what they did and how they treated, then you'll understand why the Torah commanded us to say a command. That should sound very familiar to us before. So So the Rambam is again hinting to us that if we did learn and did know the history better, we could come to a better understanding of the Torah, and that applies to all of the Torah. And this has been his repeated message through this entire section. To sum up, just as he's about to say what I just told you again, very strong in strong words. Just as according to what I have told you, the doctrines of the Sabians are remote from us today. Just like I told you before, that we don't really know or understand what the pre-monotheistic pagans were like, what their beliefs were like, what their practices were like. Right? The chronicles of those times are likewise hidden from us today. We don't really have good books and stories that tell us about what they used to do, right? Before, nowadays, even now, obviously we don't, but we have archaeology. We can understand some of their texts. We can try to piece things together and try to get a picture of it. The Rambam didn't have any of access to that. So therefore, he says, hence, if we knew them and were cognizant of the events that happened in those days, we would know in detail the reasons of many things mentioned in the Torah. So a lot of those things, Achos Lotan Timna, for example, the sister of Lotan was Timna. Leaving aside for a moment the midrashic interpretations that are of course important and interesting, but the Rambam would say, yeah, but the real reason why it was there is because in the time it was given, everybody knew who Lotan was and everybody knew who Timna was, and those names meant something, right? And when I tell you that he was his sister, right? And that's how she hooked into this family. It would mean something to you, and then you'd understand. Oh, I know why the Torah said it. The problem is that now where it's lost to us. Now, who knows? Maybe somebody one day will be digging in a place in I don't know, somewhere in who knows where, Syria or Iraq or Iran, someplace, and they'll dig up an old cuneiform that tells you in Akkadian language about Lotan and Timna, and then all of a sudden, oh, now I know why the Torah tells us this. But I'm saying this with a little bit, tongue in cheek, but the truth is that we do find this all the time. Archaeology and history enlightens us tremendous amount to understanding the Torah, and the Rambam is telling us that this is how we should be interpreting it. We should try to interpret in light of the historical evidence and knowledge that we have, and the more historical evidence and knowledge we would obtain, the better we would understand why the Torah wrote what it wrote, and so on. You should also understand, and now I'm in the next paragraph, I'm in the middle of page 615. You should also understand the status of things that are set down in writing is not the same as the status of happenings that one sees, right? That even if you do find the books from the old days, let's say you dig up an old Sabian book from 2,000 years ago, right? Or like I said, a cuneiform written in Akkadian or whatever, it's not the same as actually having been there, right? It's a story, it's nice and it's great and it helps, but nothing will ever be the same unless we find an old a webcam from 5,000 years ago, right? We're not going to know. And even if you find a webcam is better than a book to say, but it's still not the same as actually being there, where you have the sights, the smells, the feel, etc. So for in happenings that one sees, there are particulars that bring about necessary consequences of great importance, which cannot be mentioned except in a prolix manner. Accordingly, when narrations concerning these happenings are considered, the individual who reflects thinks that such narrations are too long or repetitious. We think they seem like there's no point in them. If, however, he had seen what is narrated, he would know the necessity of what is recounted. Had you been there, you'd understand why it was important to say it over. Hence, when you see narrations in the Torah that do not belong to the Torah, right, or do not belong to the law, and this time usually I translate law as Torah, but because a lot of the other translations do, but here he's differentiating. We'll see things in the Torah, meaning the written book called the Torah, right, that do not belong to the law, meaning they don't teach you any laws about how to live, and think it was not necessary to set down such and such a narration, or that it's too long a repetition. Think, what do we need these silly stories for? Who needs it? And you talk like Menashe talked, like, why do I need to know Lachos Lotan Timna, right? The reason for this is that you have not seen the particulars that necessitated that the story be told in the manner it is. You don't know, you weren't there. If you've been there, you'd understand very well why it was written. Of this kind, remember that what's really crucial here is the Rambam is not resorting to what other Jewish thinkers would resort to, and that is a Kabbalistic type or a mystical type explanation, that these words have holy meanings beyond what we see, right? And he's not even saying that a midrashic meaning, where the medrash really, what medrash really does is it fills in the holes of the story, like Lotan Stim, and then it takes little data points from the story, and using those data points, it fills in the gaps and makes a really nice, wonderful story out of it, from which we can learn lessons. But the Rambam's not doing either of those two methods to find meaning in a verse like this. He's simply doing it in an extremely Maimonidean way, rationalistic, historically accurate, right? If we knew the history, we would know why it was there. So if you really want to know, learn history. Of this kind is the enumeration of the stations of the children of Israel in the desert. Why does it list off all the places we stopped when we were wandering through the desert? Apparently, this is an enumeration that is quite useless. Who cares? We stopped here, we stopped there, we stopped there, here. Who cares? What's the difference? We wandered for 40 years, finished. That's enough, right? Because of this false fancy, when it first comes to mind, it says, and Moshe wrote there, because you might think, like exactly like I just described, who cares? The Torah makes it clear to say by the commandment of the Lord, that God commanded him. So that gives us a hint that these places are important, right? And again, there's a lot of midrashic detail and Kabbalistic details that try to find importance. And I'm not here to negate those paths of understanding. They are alternate paths. But the Rambam is not going to give us a path like that. He wants to give us a completely rationalistic way. So now the need for he's going to explain it as follows. The need for this was very great. There actually is an important need to tell us where we stopped and how long, and that we went when God told us to go, and we stopped when God told us to stop. Why? For all miracles in general are certain in the opinion of one who has seen them, right? If you visualized and saw a miracle, if you were there when the sea was split, right, it would be very clear to you that the sea was split. However, at a future time, their story becomes a mere traditional narrative, and there is a possibility for the hearer to consider it untrue, right? After a while, people say, it never really happened. Yeah, whatever, it's a nice story. Yeah, whatever, people made up the story, so on and so forth. You know how it goes. People already denied the reality. I mean, it's horrifying, but I mean, it's become standard in the anti-Semitic internet world that October 7th was made up, and that wasn't even 2 years ago. And there's clear evidence of every. There's no doubt. Even, I mean, but they still, it's to them it's considered. Of course, it's made up. It's all baloney, right? And when you read and you're in the forums, occupied by such haters. But so all kinds of 9/11, all these conspiracy theories of things that happened within recent memory, right? So you can imagine what it would be 100 years later, 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, however long ago Yetziat Mitzrayim was, 3,000 years later. It's like, it is well known that it is impossible and inconceivable that a miracle lasts permanently throughout the succession of generations so that all men can see it. There's no such thing, Rambam says, as a miracle that remains part of nature, that we always see it. The point being made by most of the commentaries on it is that if there was a miracle that has been continuing all this time, then it wouldn't be a miracle. It would be part of nature. It would be something that we all see. Like, we wake up every morning and the sun rises in the east, right? We don't call that a miracle because it happens every day, right? So it's just nature. So we study it and figure out why the sun rises in the east, right? So anything that would happen, if the sea in a certain spot would split every day at 2 o'clock, that would be nature. Maybe we could explain it scientifically, maybe not. And we try to come up with a phenomenon, but it wouldn't be a miracle, right? Miracle by definition is a one-time event, right? So now one of the main miracles of the Torah, one of the miracles of the Torah, and one of the greatest among them, is the sojourn of Israel for 40 years in the desert and finding the manna there every day. The fact that we survived wandering around the wilderness for 40 years, and hundreds of thousands or millions of people, if you add it all up, right? That's a pretty big miracle, right? So, and that only happened once in history, back then. So for that desert was a place where were serpents and fiery serpents and scorpions, and there was no water. So those are places that are very remote from cultivated land and unnatural for man. This is out there and nowhere, not a place where people really can inhabit. It is no place of seed or figs or vines or pomegranates and so on. It is also said that it is a land that no man had passed through and so on. The text of the Torah states, "Ye have not eaten bread, neither have ye drunk wine or strong drink," and so on. All these are manifest, visible miracles. So now God may be exalted knew that in the future, what happens to traditional narratives would happen to those miracles. Everyone would say, they didn't wander in the desert. Yeah, somebody wandered once in the desert, and he came back and told a tall tale about wandering for 40 years. And then his kids said it was a whole family, and their kids said it was a whole nation. And before you know it, we have this whole story made up, right? So in order to make it sound real, people would think that the children of Israel, they'll say and if you're going to tell me they did wander, it must have been because it really wasn't such a wilderness. There was food there. They were wandering near places where other people were going, and of course they didn't get man. They stole food from farmers that were nearby, or make up stories as to how they survived, right? So like the deserts inhabited at present by the Arabs, right? So those deserts, right, those wildernesses, the Arabs learned ways to survive in. They find oases, they find places, they figure it out. However they do it, they figure it out, right? Or that it consisted of places in which it was possible to till or reap or feed on plants that were to be found there, or that it was natural, or maybe it was a wilderness where this food just fell every day. That was just a natural occurrence in this place, always to come down, or that there were wells of water in those places. Therefore, all these fancies, so all the stories that people would have told about how we survived, right, are rebutted. The Torah says, no, these are the places. These are real places, right? It has to list the story. It's like if you share the details, if the details work, right? Remember, if like, what's the first question you'll ask somebody if somebody comes to you with a tall tale? I caught a fish and it was 60 pounds and it was the biggest fish. And where did you go? What lake were you in? What kind of boat were you on? Right? If the guy's, you see, he's making up details, and obviously it's a bunch of baloney. But if he tells you, I was using this boat, I was using this lure, I was on this lake, and it was Tuesday morning on the 4th of May, and so then it starts sounding more real, right? So all these miracles are confirmed through the enumeration of those stations, so men could see them, and thus know how great was the miracle constituted by the sojourn of the human species in those places for 40 years. So you understand, you go look at those places and you'll know. And remember, nowadays we may not be able to identify them, but at the time of the Torah was given, when Moshe was writing those place names, he and everyone presumably of the time knew exactly where those places were, and they knew exactly that if you lived for 40 years over there must have been something pretty wild going on for it to work out, right? For the same reason, Yoshua cursed him who would ever build up Yericho, so that this miracle should subsist permanently. So people should always know that Yericho was destroyed. You can always go there and see the destroyed walls in Jericho. For whoever would see the wall sunk in the ground would clearly understand that such cannot be the aspect of demolished building. It wasn't demolished. You can tell that it wasn't demolished by an ordinary war, right? But rather something extraordinary happened, but that it sank through a miracle. Okay. So similarly, also it's dictum at the commandment of the Lord they pitched, and we're still on the wandering in the desert idea, right? Because it says over there that they camped and that they left, they got up to march or to travel, or they stopped to rest at the commandment of God. That might suffice for the narrative. That would have been enough to say that God commanded. And it might appear, when one thinks about it at first, that everything dealing with the subject that comes afterwards is needless expiation on the matter. I refer to it saying, when the cloud tarried long, the description of the cloud, right? And so it was when the cloud was, and so it was there for 2 days, they stayed for 2 days, and so on. Why is that detail necessary? When God said no, God said go. God said stop, finish. That's enough. Why do we need all the details? So I shall inform you the reason for all those particulars being given. The reason is that this story was to be confirmed with a view to the destruction of the opinion held at the time, and even up to now by the religious communities. But there are a lot of people, by the religious communities meaning the Muslims and the Christians, right? Or who would say, well, hey, the Jews lost their way. They didn't know where they were going, right? Maybe not the Christians, because they technically believe in what they call the Old Testament. But the Muslims were saying, and the Jews were a bunch of losers. They wandered around for 40 years, and then they came up with some miracle story about God and surviving. The bottom line is they got lost, right? as the Arabs presently designated the desert the Alti, which in Arabic means a land, a lost land, or something, or Tahu, right? Which is very similar to the Hebrew word Tohu, a land, a place of nothingness, right? And did not know the road. They got lost. There were no signs back then. They didn't have a GPS. They didn't have a map. They didn't have a guide. They're not experienced in wandering in the wilderness. So they got lost and wandered. Scripture accordingly is engaged in expounding and corroborating the fact that those irregular stations, the return to some of them, and the difference between the lengths of their staying at every station, so they stayed at one for 18 years, another a day, and a third one for a night, they were all determined by divine decree and were not due to having lost their way, but depended on the rising of the pillar of the cloud. The Torah wanted to explain clearly that nobody was lost, that it was done because of God told them and there was a reason. Therefore, all these particulars are given. The Torah has already made it clear that that stretch of road was short. The Torah told us itself that they could have had a much shorter route, right? They could have gotten to the land of Israel a lot faster than 40 years. I mean, just you look at a map today, from Egypt, anywhere in Egypt, to anywhere in Israel, I mean, even if you walk by foot, is a lot less than 40 years. You can probably do it in a few days, maybe a week or two, maybe 3, but certainly not 40 years, right? So were all of them determined? Okay. So therefore, all these, the Torah made it. Yes, I refer to the stretch between Choreb, where they betook themselves with a certain purpose, where we got the Torah, to what he may be exalted as commanded. He shall serve God upon this mountain, and Kadesh Barnea, where the cultivated land begins according to text, which is the beginning of the land of Israel that's habitable, where they can grow food and live and settle, etc. The length of this stretch is an 11 days march, right? Which correlates with generally what we know to the geography be today. 11 days, you can make the walk, right? This is not a road in which one may err for 40 years. I mean, no matter how lost you are, no matter how bad your GPS is, right? 40 years is a stretch, right? The reason for their tarrying are the causes literally stated in the Torah. So now, remember, similarly to the reasons for the mitzvot, I think it's pretty clear from the Rambam's language, right? Or very clear that he's suggesting to us reasons, and each one he showed us how to apply his rule. Think about the circumstances of the world at the time, to the extent that you could know them. Think about the ideas that people could make and could try to understand those stories in the Torah. And then you'll understand why the Torah wrote it in the way it wrote it, in order to either to show, to counteract, right, or to contradict. That's the word I'm looking for. Those bad reasons, or to teach us a specific lesson, or they may be for reasons which we don't fully understand because we don't know the history. We don't know what the world was like then. But if we did, we would then understand. In a similar way, whenever the cause for a story is being narrated is hidden from you, and this is there is a strong reason for that story. This is the end of this chapter. Whenever you don't know, don't think there is no reason. There is a good reason, right? Apply to the whole matter the principle which the sages made them memorably possess to draw their attention. There is no vain thing from you, and if it is vain, it is because of you, not because of the Torah. If you think it's meaningless and doesn't have a purpose, that's because you don't know something, not because the Torah doesn't know something. It's funny, I was just building, I bought an armoire to hang my clothes in, right? And I got it, from online, and it comes unassembled. And I have a rule when you assemble these things. If you can't find the screw, or you think this screw doesn't fit in this hole, or the hole should be on this side, but it looks like it's on that side, it's you. You took the wrong screw, or you're not looking carefully enough at the instructions. You can get angry. You can call the company if they have a phone number, but 99 times out of 100, it's not going to be it's because you weren't following the instructions, or because it said letter K and you took letter J or something, whatever, So most of the time it's because of you. That's where. So if the Torah says something that we don't understand, it's not because it's purposeless. It's because we don't know the reason. But if we understood all the circumstances and everything surrounding it, then we would have the reason. The key here being that the Rambam is exhorting us to find logical, rational, scientifically valid, historically valid reasons for the verses in the Torah that seem to have no obvious purpose, and that's the path that he wants to set us on. I just heard thunder behind me, so if we lose internet, it's not because I don't like you guys. But anyway, so that's the end of chapter 50. Chapter 51 begins a very famous parable, which is really like is how the Rambam wraps up the book of Guide for the Perplexed. It's really kind of it's the template that he lays out for the last several chapters. So it's really the grand finale, and the story of the parable. I mean, I could start it tonight, but first let me open the floor for observations, questions, stuff on chapter 50. But we're definitely going to, even if I do read just the parable tonight, analyzing it, reading the Rambam's description of it, what it's supposed to teach us, etc., that we're obviously going to have to work on next week and the next couple of weeks. So first, any questions, observations on chapter 50?
Yeah, I have an observation / question. It's Jeff. You know, one of the we know that all the Jews were slaves, they had to die out. So I always thought that was obvious. That's why it took 40 years for them to traverse what they could have done in 12 days. So there was a reason for dragging this thing out. But to me, it's obvious. Doesn't that seem more obvious than?
Yeah, well, it's not. What you're saying is not contradictory at all. That's the reason why God had the Jews wander in the desert for 40 years, because that generation needed to die out.
But why didn't he say that?
What, in the Torah?
No, in explaining why.
No, so because Rambam he wasn't explaining to us why they wandered for 40 years. He was just telling us that the fact is that we wandered for 40 years, and that's a great miracle, right? He's explaining to us why the Torah had to describe to us all the place names. Couldn't have been enough if the Torah just said, we stopped in a lot of places, we wandered around, right? You know, and God said we needed to stay for 40 years till everyone died, and then we got out of the wilderness.
Well, but if the purpose of this is to kind of fool us, it seems to me he might have included that as just in passing as to why all these 42 stations had to be
Well,
mentioned.
it's not trying to fool us. It's listing the actual stations, the historically real places where we stopped and camped.
But doesn't that help with creating the myth, so to speak, to give that kind of specificity?
I mean, only if you assume that it's not real. But if it's real, if you believe that the Torah is giving an accurate description of where we stopped, and the Rambam had no reason not to assume that these are real places, right?
Okay.
Right? And I'm going to make that same assumption. These are real places that we really stopped and stayed for those amounts of time. So if that's true, but why? Why do I need to know? Right? Is you and we're not going to go touring, Kadesh Barnea today. I mean, you might try, but who knows? You'll find a place. Someone, this is it. I don't know. It's not. What you're going to wander around the desert. Somebody will find you a rock and say, this is where they stopped. Okay, so you'll have a spiritual uplifting. So it doesn't mean anything to me today for that. I mean, maybe an archaeologist one day will dig up a place like that and it'll have some importance. And then you can say, oh, you see, now I know why the Torah told me, right? Because now I understand. I learned something from the fact that the Torah said the Jews camped here, and now we found the archaeological evidence that they camped here, and you find something that happened, some correlation, you learn something from it. The Rambam would have loved that, but he obviously didn't have access to that knowledge. But that would have been following the same thing that the Rambam was trying to teach us, right?
Okay.
Anyway, yeah. I saw Yosef, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say actually about that when biblical criticism started about 150 years ago, and unfortunately it's continuing today, even in yeshivas, where when I was in yeshiva, they called it Tanakh B'Gova Einayim, that the prophets and kings are like our peers, and we can criticize them like anybody. The bottom line is that approach is we are already assuming that the Bible is wrong and that we are right, or that science is right, and so we're going to mess it up. But even Rambam, as a rationalistic, would not say that that's the only proof, because when Yirmiyahu talks about the Molech, you mentioned the Avodah Zarah and stuff like that, he's talking about things that he himself saw. He's not contradicting the Torah; he's supplementing it, and even if there wasn't such a practice, Hashem wanted us to refrain from treating other gods as equals, and that's the bottom line. Unfortunately, too many today, like you said, even in yeshivas, they criticize the avot and others as if they were, their contemporaries, and it's not at all true.
Yeah. And I understand what you're saying. And it's not the main thing is just we shouldn't be criticizing. We're trying to learn from it, you know. So if and the more knowledge we can apply, the more real knowledge we have, the more we'll appreciate. That the Rambam is really setting out something really beautiful here. And that is, don't be afraid to learn more, learn more, and then you'll appreciate the Torah even more, right? The verse says something about achos lotan timna, right? And we have no idea what the social constructs were. We'd have no idea what the stories were, what the myths were, what the movies, so to speak, was about. If somebody were to write today something about, I don't know, whatever movie's popular today, and everyone in contemporary society would know what they're talking about. And then you'd find 500 years from now, somebody would find this reference, and what in the world is it? Who needs it? What's important? But in the time that it was said, it meant a lot. So now if 500 years from now somebody goes back and they understand the reference in the movie, right, because they look it up and they see what people are talking about, and they say, oh, now I understand what they were trying to say. Wow, that's pretty interesting. And so Rambam is saying, if we learn and know more, then when we look at the Torah and say, oh my goodness, wow, that's really cool. Like the Torah is telling me something really, really interesting, and it's our lack of knowledge that leads to us looking at certain verses and not understanding them. If we knew more, they would make even more sense. They would mean even more to us, and that's true. Like, instead of biblical criticism, we look at biblical archaeology, right? Instead of criticizing, if you look at the study that's going on today, from archaeological, historical, from the analyzing language and all kinds of things, sociological, anthropological, even geological knowledge, and learning what the places were like, what the temperatures and climates were like that the people were living in, what the different crops that they would eat, what garbage they would throw out, what kind of buildings they built, what kind of materials they built, who they traded with, how did they travel, what kind of animals they had, all of these things, and you put it together and you build a picture. All of a sudden, so many things come to life and mean so much more. So, instead of criticizing, we should just learn more, and then we'll appreciate more about what the Torah has to tell us. And that's, if we've learned anything from this entire book, this is probably, I don't know, I probably said this before about other things, but but this is one of the most important things to remember. We shouldn't be afraid. The Rambam is so important, and don't be afraid of learning more. And don't be afraid of knowledge. Just the knowledge will lead you to a better appreciation of the Torah. Knowledge doesn't lead you away from the Torah, God forbid. And that's, so many people think that their two are incompatible, but it's just the opposite. The Rambam is telling us that they're not just complementary, but they're necessary one for the other. Anyway, I don't really want to start the parable this week. I'm going to start it next week, or maybe, we have about five minutes or so. I'll read the no, forget it. No, we'll do it next week.
Okay.
We'll do it next week, and we're going to be spending a bit of time on it. So even though we only have 4 chapters left, we still got a good couple of weeks to as we build up to the grand finale, which we're just about to start. I would say the grand finale starts next week and goes from chapter 51 to 54, and that's the end.
Sure.
All right.
Can I ask one detail in terms of Sorry? Should we buy the book that you're going to be studying. So we.
Yeah, I'll tell you. So I was going to talk about it. Well, hold on. Wait 1 second. See, there's a big problem. The Kuzari was also written in Judeo-Arabic, right? Similar to the guide. And the only translations that we have that are direct from the from Arabic are into Hebrew. So there's classical Hebrew and modern Hebrew, scholarly works in which they translate the Kuzari from Arabic into Hebrew. Into English, as far as I know, and if somebody can find another one, but as far as I can tell, I'm pretty sure this is right. There are many English Kuzaris, but they're all translations from the Hebrew. So they're a translation of the translation. So the best one that I have that I was going to use is this one. It's by Korobkin. My father recommended this.
Could you spell it, because it's hard for us to?
Oh, it's written in mirror writing on the picture, I see. Okay, so it's by the Torah Classics Library are the publishers, Feldheim Publishers, I'm sorry. It's the Torah Classics series on Feldheim Publishers, and it's read by Daniel Korobkin, Korobkin, and that's the English one that I'm going to use. And the Hebrew, I haven't yet decided which one I'm going to use. The one I've used for years is Rav Kapach, who is the same Hebrew version of the Rambam, because he did a translation from the original Arabic into Hebrew of the Kuzri and the Moreh Nevuchim. The problem is, though, that he wrote the translation to the Kuzri, and I didn't know this until recently, when he was young. It was like one of the first things he wrote. And then he put it on a shelf somewhere and ignored it for like 40 years. And then after he became famous, right, and he translated the Rambam's works and other things, and he became internationally renowned as like one of the leading scholars on Maimonides, people bugged him about the Kuzri, and then finally somebody pushed him and he published it. But he himself said that it wasn't as good a job. And it's good, but it's not nearly the same quality as the ones he did when he was much farther on in his career. So I have that Hebrew one. That's the one that I've always used. But after reading the story that I just told you, I think there's another couple out there, and I'm gonna look and I'll tell you which Hebrew one I'm gonna use. But for the English, that's the one that you should get. And if somebody wants to sit down for the next 10 years and do an edition of the Kuzri, and you got to learn Judeo-Arabic first. So you got a long way to go, unless some of you already speak that language.
I have Korobkin, but it's from Jason Aronson Incorporated. It's a different publisher from.
He changed publishers.
This was published in 1998.
Let me see. Well, I don't know. This one, the one I have is Feldheim, so maybe the publishers bought it from each other. The one that I have is copyright 2013.
So that's after, yeah.
So actually, no. Oh, yeah. So it says an earlier version was published in 1998 by Jason Aronson, and then newly translated and annotated in 2009, and then a second edition in 2023. So I have the 2023 one. I don't know if it's worth buying another one. So, but I have no idea how much changes they made. But
find out.
Yeah, I guess so. All right. So, see y'all next week. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Saul.
Yes.
Thank you, Saul.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.